this episode, we are moving into a web security problem that can feel strange at first because the victim may not do anything that looks obviously dangerous. Cross-site request forgery, CSRF, is one of those topics that becomes much easier once you stop imagining a hacker breaking into a system directly and instead picture a trusted user being quietly manipulated into sending a request on the attacker's behalf. That is what makes this flaw so important for new security learners, because it shows that a legitimate login session can become part of the problem if an application trusts requests too easily. The system sees a valid user, a valid browser, and an already established session, so it may process the request without realizing the user never truly intended it. For someone studying CySA+, this matters because it connects application design, user behavior, session handling, and trust boundaries in a very practical way. Once you understand why a forged request can look legitimate to a server, the rest of the topic starts to make much more sense. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At its core, CSRF happens when a web application accepts a state-changing request simply because it appears to come from an already authenticated user. The attacker is not stealing the password in that moment, and they are not always breaking the session directly. Instead, they trick the victim's browser into sending a request that the browser is already authorized to send because the victim is logged in. If the application does not have a good way to tell whether the request was intentionally made by the user or merely triggered from somewhere else, the server may go ahead and carry it out. That means the trusted session becomes the weak point, not because it was fake, but because the application failed to confirm that the action truly originated from the right place and for the right reason. This is why the word forgery matters so much in the name. The request may be technically real, but the intent behind it has been forged, and that difference can be enough to cause real harm. A simple way to picture this is to imagine a person already signed into an online banking site, an employee portal, or a shopping account in one browser tab. Then the same person visits a malicious page, clicks a deceptive link, opens a compromised advertisement, or reads content that causes the browser to automatically submit a hidden request in the background. Because the user is already authenticated to the legitimate site, the browser may automatically include the session information needed for that request to be accepted. The bank or portal sees the session and thinks the user is asking to change an address, transfer funds, approve an action, or update an account setting. The victim may not even realize anything happened at all if the request is invisible or looks like an ordinary page load. That quiet, indirect nature is what makes CSRF so different from attacks that rely on obvious malware or obvious credential theft. The attacker is exploiting trust already established between the user's browser and the target application. That relationship between the browser and the server is central to understanding why this attack works. Web applications often rely on session identifiers, cookies, or similar mechanisms to remember that a person has already logged in and should not need to enter credentials again with every click. This improves usability because it makes sites practical to use, but it also means the browser carries proof of identity from request to request. If an attacker can cause the victim's browser to send a request to the target application, the browser may include that trusted session information automatically. From the server's point of view, the request can look perfectly normal unless the application uses additional checks to confirm where the request came from and whether it was intentionally initiated by the user. That is the central lesson for beginners. Authentication proves who the session belongs to, but it does not automatically prove that every action taken during that session was deliberate. CSRF lives in that gap between identity and intent. Many learners first confuse CSRF with phishing, session hijacking, or password theft, but those are different ideas even though they can appear in the same broader threat landscape. In a phishing attack, the attacker usually tries to trick the user into giving away credentials or other sensitive information directly. In session hijacking, the attacker may try to steal the session itself so they can impersonate the user. In a CSRF attack, the attacker often does neither of those things. They may never know the password and may never take permanent control of the session. Instead, they ride along on the trust already present in the victim's browser and use it to cause a specific action. That distinction matters because defenses that are useful against one type of attack may not fully stop the others. A strong password does not by itself stop CSRF, and a user can be genuinely logged in securely, yet still be vulnerable if the application does not validate requests carefully enough. The kinds of actions that can be targeted through CSRF depend on what the application allows an authenticated user to do. If the request can change account settings, update a shipping address, modify a phone number, submit a payment, create a new user, or alter security preferences, then those actions may become attractive targets. Sometimes the attacker wants financial gain, such as causing a purchase or redirecting money. Other times the attacker wants persistence, such as adding a recovery email, changing notification settings, or adjusting a password reset path so future account takeover becomes easier. In enterprise environments, the same concept can affect internal admin portals, cloud consoles, ticketing tools, human resources systems, or collaboration platforms. The key is that the request changes something meaningful on the server side. Pages that merely display information are usually less central to this specific flaw, while actions that modify data, permissions, or decisions are where the real risk lives. For CSRF to succeed, several conditions usually need to line up, and understanding those conditions helps analysts think clearly about exposure. The victim generally needs to be authenticated to the target application at the time the malicious request is triggered. The application must rely on automatically included session information and must not sufficiently verify that the request came from a trusted interaction within the application itself. The attacker also needs a way to get the victim to visit or load something that causes the request to be sent, whether through email, messaging, social content, an embedded object, or a compromised page. That combination is why this flaw is partly technical and partly behavioral. It depends on the web application's design, but it also depends on user activity and browsing context. Analysts benefit from seeing both sides of that picture, because an application can be technically exposed while practical risk still depends on how likely it is that users will encounter a trigger and how valuable the targeted action would be. One helpful way to understand the danger is to distinguish between authentication and authorization on one side and request validation on the other. An application may do a perfectly good job of requiring a valid login before a user can access sensitive features. It may also do a reasonable job of making sure only certain roles can perform certain functions. But if the application then accepts an action request without checking whether that specific request was intentionally generated within the trusted workflow, it may still be vulnerable. In other words, the server knows who the user is and what the user is allowed to do, but it does not adequately confirm that the user actually meant to do it at that moment. That is the subtle weakness CSRF exploits. New learners often assume that a login prompt solves most application trust problems, yet this topic shows that identity alone is not enough. Sensitive actions need their own protections because a session that proves identity can still be abused by forged intent. One of the classic defenses is the use of unique anti-forgery tokens, even though you do not need to understand programming details to grasp the principle. The idea is that when a legitimate user loads a form or action page, the application includes a secret value tied to that user session or interaction context. When the user later submits the request, the server checks for that value to confirm the request came through the expected application flow rather than from an unrelated external source. An attacker who can trigger the browser to send a basic request may not know that secret value and therefore cannot easily produce a request that passes validation. What matters from the CySA Plus point of view is not memorizing developer syntax, but understanding the security purpose behind the defense. The application adds a second signal that helps prove intentional origin, not just authenticated identity. That makes it much harder for a background request triggered from somewhere else to blend in as a valid action. Other protections also matter because modern web security works best in layers rather than through a single perfect control. Some applications use cookie settings that limit when browsers automatically send session information across different contexts, reducing the opportunities for cross-site abuse. Others validate the expected source of a request through request metadata, workflow checks, or re-authentication for especially sensitive actions. User interface design can help too, especially when very important transactions require a clear confirmation step rather than happening silently in the background. None of these ideas should be treated as magic by themselves, because attackers often succeed when one defense is missing and the rest were never designed to compensate. The broader lesson is that trustworthy actions should require more than a valid session alone. If a request changes security settings, moves money, approves access, or modifies important records, the application should behave as though intent must be demonstrated rather than assumed. That mindset lowers the chance that a user's normal browsing session can be turned into an attack tool. It is also useful to compare CSRF with cross-site scripting, XSS, because students often hear those two terms around the same time and blend them together. XSS generally involves injecting malicious script into a page so that code runs in the victim's browser, often within the trusted context of the vulnerable site. CSRF, by contrast, is about tricking the browser into sending an unwanted but otherwise valid request to a site where the user is already authenticated. They are different flaws, but they can relate to each other because XSS can make CSRF defenses less effective in some scenarios by allowing an attacker to act more directly within the trusted site context. That is why security topics often connect rather than staying neatly separate. A defender needs to recognize not just individual weaknesses, but also how one flaw may support another. For beginners, the key takeaway is simple. XSS focuses on malicious code execution in the browser, while CSRF focuses on forged requests that abuse existing trust. When security analysts think about the impact of CSRF, they should avoid assuming every case is equally severe. The damage depends heavily on what actions can be triggered and how much privilege the victim has. A forged request that changes a newsletter preference is very different from one that adds a new administrator, updates payroll details, changes a supplier payment destination, or disables a security setting on a critical internal platform. Context matters as well. If the application is internet-facing, frequently used, and handles valuable business functions, the exposure may be much greater than in a narrow internal tool with limited permissions. Analysts should also think about how easy it is to deliver the malicious trigger and whether important user populations spend time in situations where such triggers are likely to succeed. Good risk thinking is never just about naming the flaw. It is about understanding what the flaw enables, whose session is most valuable, and how technical weakness interacts with everyday user behavior in the real environment. Detection can be tricky because a successful CSRF event may look like an ordinary user action in logs unless the organization has strong context and monitoring. The request may come from the real user's session, from the real device, and through the real browser, which means identity-based alerts alone may not stand out. Security teams may instead need to look for unusual timing, improbable account changes, unexpected administrative actions, odd patterns of sensitive updates, or actions that do not fit the user's normal behavior. Help desk reports can also matter, especially when users say settings changed unexpectedly or transactions occurred without a clear explanation. This is one reason application logging should capture meaningful context around sensitive actions rather than recording only whether the request technically succeeded. Analysts often solve these problems by combining user reports, transaction history, session behavior, and knowledge of how the application is supposed to work. The better the organization understands normal application flow, the easier it becomes to spot actions that were valid at the protocol level but suspicious at the behavioral level. There is also an important mindset lesson here for anyone learning vulnerability management. CSRF reminds us that trust on the web is rarely just about whether a user typed the right password. Secure systems need to ask deeper questions about how actions are initiated, how intent is confirmed, and whether the browser should be allowed to carry trust automatically across boundaries without additional proof. That makes this topic relevant far beyond one exam objective. It teaches you to look at application behavior through a defensive lens and to notice how convenience can quietly create risk when session handling, request validation, and user interactions are not designed carefully enough. For a CySA Plus learner, that is valuable because analysts often review findings that sit between software design and practical business impact. CSRF is exactly that kind of issue. It may start as a technical flaw in request validation, but its consequences can reach deeply into fraud, account abuse, internal administration, and loss of trust. By the end of this discussion, the most important point to carry forward is that CSRF is an abuse of trust, not a dramatic break-in that obviously smashes a door open. The attacker takes advantage of the fact that the browser already has a legitimate relationship with the target application and then tries to make the application accept a request that the user never truly intended to send. That is why the best defenses do more than check whether a session is valid. They also verify whether the request itself is legitimate in context, expected in workflow, and meaningfully tied to the user's actual interaction. Once you see that distinction, the whole topic becomes much clearer and much more practical. You start recognizing that secure design is not only about proving identity at login, but also about protecting the integrity of actions taken afterward. For a new cybersecurity student, that is exactly the kind of understanding that turns a confusing web term into a real and useful security concept.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.